prayer is a paradox, right? Here is a God who says, I work everything after the counsel of my own will, right? Here is the crucifixion. Let's use that as a case example, where he says in Acts chapter 2, and Peter's preaching, by God's foreordained plan this happened, and yet Christ is in the garden praying about, let this cup pass from me, right? So prayer, right? Could Jesus have changed God's mind about the cross? It's a good question. Answer? No, right? Well, that's kind of weird because he prays for other things like, the deadness of Lazarus, which would seem like God's will. He's dead. He prays and he comes back to life. The question is, on a theological level, did God go, oh, okay, right? What we learned elsewhere, and we learned it just in Romans here, was it last message in Romans? God does not change his mind. He is not a man that he would change his mind. That's the Balaam example in Numbers 20. What is Balaam? Numbers what? Bible, Sunday school graduates? The Balaam story in the book of Numbers. God is not a man that he would change his mind. So, whatever we see elsewhere, we've got to interpret in light of a God who works out everything after the counsel of his will and doesn't change his mind. It's like, has anybody ever seen God? Right? We get these absolute statements of God who no one has seen or can see, and all through Exodus, we're seeing God. Right? What's that all about? Whatever this means that we cannot see God means something in an absolute sense. No one can see him. No one has seen him or can see him. And yet, whatever's happening when Moses is hid in the cleft of the rock and he goes by and off goes his back and he sees God. And we saw it in the book of Genesis. You've been reading with us through the Bible. Seeing God, right? Jacob wrestling with this personage as I've seen God. Whatever you saw, you didn't really see God in the absolute sense. You saw something of a manifestation of God, but it's not in an absolute sense. Can we change God's mind in an absolute sense? The answer is no. Can we have an experience, right, that takes us on a journey to follow the will of God into, even in Lazarus' case, a grave and then out of a grave? Absolutely. And God says we ought to do that. He even describes it in James 5 as the effectual prayer of a righteous man accomplishes much. But I'm along the journey of having God align my heart with his in prayer, and it is a mystery. It is a paradox. But God asks us to pray. Now, when my kid asks me this question, I say, we got to keep praying. Because the question for him is, what good is prayer then, right? And my answer is, God has told us to pray. I believe that the absolute statements of God are, God is working everything after the counsel of his will, Ephesians chapter 1. He does not change his mind, right? The book of Numbers makes that clear. Malachi, he does not change. He's an immutable God. Everything is right on God's schedule. And yet, God has asked us to pray. And back to another great quote from Carson. I should not use a biblical truth in an unbiblical way. I may believe in the sovereignty of God, but that doesn't mean I should stop sharing the gospel. I may believe in the sovereignty of God, but that doesn't mean that I don't pray for God to change things, right? This is an experience of what we often call, in studying these texts, an anthropomorphism. It's at least a subcategory of an anthropomorphism. It is a description of God's interaction with people, right, that puts this on a human anthropos, a human level, right, that takes Moses along for the ride and in so doing accomplishes God's perfect will. That's the experience we have with Moses. It's like Jonah preaching to the Ninevites, right? The whole point is if they repent, right, which Jonah doesn't want to happen, God would relent and not bring this calamity upon them. And he knew that was going to happen. I knew you would do that. You're a compassionate God. But the point is, what was that all about? Another book you might add to it that's not quite so difficult is J.I. Packer's little book called Evangelism and the Sovereignty of God. If you haven't read that one, that's a winner. Evangelism and the Sovereignty of God. He deals with the same problem, because it's the same problem. The issue of prayer and God's sovereignty is the same problem as election and evangelism. It's the same problem, right? What good does my evangelism do? God says, evangelize, and I'll use that to get things done. Prayer, what good was prayer do? God says, listen, don't worry about the theological conundrum. Pray, and I'll use that to get things done. See? So it's a tough question, but I would say prayer and providence would be a great long-term study, and a good primer that gets you started would be Evangelism and the Sovereignty of God.